Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about procedures for collecting data. This is going to be using applied behavior analysis principles. So that big long definition there basically just means that behavior analysts intervene to improve appropriate behavior and decrease inappropriate behavior, oftentimes by means of a functional assessment, which is figuring out why it happens. And one of the ways we do this is through data collection. So there are four main rationales for collecting data. The first is that you need to collect a baseline measurement, which is basically how often the behavior is occurring before the intervention. A good example for how this would be, let's say you're going on a diet and your diet is to eat a Snickers bar every 2 hours for a month. So the first step would be to weigh yourself before you start the diet, which is the intervention. So this would be your baseline, or which is where you are before the intervention begins. So next you weigh yourself every day. In a month you analyze how much your weight has changed over the course of the intervention. More than likely your weight will have increased from the baseline and you can conclude that the intervention is ineffective. The second rationale for proper data collection is that it allows you to evaluate the intervention while it is occurring and once it is complete. This allows the teacher to use data to alter his or her instruction based on the effectiveness of the intervention. Finally, collecting data allows for increased accountability of the teachers. This means that it's the teacher's responsibility to improve the lives of their students, and accurate data collection systems will ensure that this happens in a way that can be evaluated by the teacher and supervisors. Here's a common way that data is expressed. The baseline over the frequency of disruptions is graphed on the left in black. Next, the intervention, some sort of verbal praise, is graphed on the right in red. You can see that the frequency of disruptions is reduced significantly from the baseline to the intervention phase, and you can safely assume that the intervention was effective. But before you can begin to collect data, you must operationally define the target behavior, and that behavior must be observable and measurable. An observable behavior is external. Think of something you can see with the senses, visually or hearing it. And it must be measurable. It can be defined and described so that instances and non-instances of the behavior is clear. For example, aggression is way too general and it can mean different things to other people, but hits or kicks others is much more specific. In the second example, disrespectful is too general because what's disrespectful for one person could not be for another, whereas makes negative verbal statements, noises, or nonverbal facial expressions is much more specific and it's unambiguous. Please answer yes or no if the following descriptions of a behavior are objective and measurable. Please pause the video now. Number 1. No. What does attentive look like? Someone could be looking right at you and not being attentive at all. Number 2. No. What does knowing something look like? You could say something more like, can provide an example of positive and negative reinforcement when prompted by the teacher. Number 3. Yes, this clearly defines what counts as following teacher's directions. Adding a specific time interval makes it even better and more specific. Number 4. No. What does developing an understanding look like? Could say something like correctly calculates 10 simple 1-digit by 1-digit addition problems with 90% accuracy. Number 5. This one could be yes or no. It would be better to specify the exact behavior the directions are attempting to evoke. Number 6. Yes, while it could be clear, correctly calculating reliability can be measured and observed. Number 7. Yes, you can observe and measure whether the student is able to do this. Number 8. No, you would want to say can demonstrate the ability to. Hopefully those examples have shown you why it is so important to properly operationally define behavior. The 3 key characteristics of operational definitions is objectivity, which means you only select behaviors or environmental events that can be directly observed. Second, clarity means that the operational definition is so clear that someone unfamiliar with the target behavior could identify its occurrence by just reading the definition. Finally, completeness means that the definition includes the occurrences and non-occurrences of the target behavior. A very, very detailed and clear operational definition allows accurate data to be collected across different individuals. For example, if there's multiple teachers collecting data over a student or something like that. Please take a moment to read the following example of biting others and attempting to bite others that is operationally defined. Now that we know how to operationally define a behavior, we must select the appropriate data collection system. Please read the following two examples. Should we measure each child's tantrums using the same data collection procedure? If you answered no, you would be absolutely correct. The individual student's behaviors must be analyzed and you have to select a proper data collection procedure based off of it. In order to select the proper data collection system, we must go over the various dimensions of behavior, the first of which being frequency, or the total number of times a student displays the behavior. For example, James threw 4 objects, James got out of his seat 6 times, completed 6 out of 10 problems, or followed 3 out of 10 directions. It's basically a total tally of how often it occurred. A second dimension is the rate, or the frequency expressed in a ratio with time. So an example of this would be Anna kicked a peer 30 times in a 10-minute observation. So you could say the frequency was 30 times, but if you want to express it as a rate, it would be 30 kicks divided by 10, which would be approximately 3 kicks a minute. The third dimension is duration, or the total amount of time a student engages in or displays the behavior in an interval. So Donna laid on the floor for 10 minutes. Jamie was off task for 45 minutes. Basically, when the behavior occurs, you would start a stopwatch, and when it stops, you would stop it and then keep going on and off like that. It's also useful because you can get a percentage of how often it happened during the interval. So for example, Mary was out of her seat for a total of 78 minutes in a 180-minute interval. So 78 divided by 180 would be 43% of the interval she was out of her seat. A fourth dimension is latency, or how long it takes a person to begin to perform the behavior after the instruction was given. For example, after the teacher direction to get out his book, John took 5 minutes to get the book out. A second example would be after asking the student to start working on his worksheet, it took him 2 minutes to start on the first problem. A fifth dimension is the topography, or the shape or form of which the specific behavior looks like. It's basically the physical form. So, during a tantrum, Stan screams, swears, and throws an object. That's the topography of a tantrum. When Sam writes his name, he writes it backwards so it reads MAS. So that's describing what it looks like. A sixth dimension is the force, or the intensity at which the behavior is displayed. For example, Juan at times writes with such pressure that he breaks the pencil point. Max speaks so softly that a person standing 3 feet away cannot hear and thus cannot repeat what he said. Marla kicked the ball so hard that she kicked 2 holes in the divider. The final dimension we will be discussing is the locus, or the place where the behavior occurs in the environment or on a specific part of the body. For example, Wayne writes his name on the bottom of his test paper, not the top where it should be. During a tantrum, Jordan hits his ears repeatedly. When she bites herself, Marla bites herself on the left hand between her thumb and her index finger. Now that we know the dimensions, we must do 2 things before selecting and setting up our data collection system. The first is to look at the dimension of your behavior that is the most concerning. For example, if the behavior is self-injurious behavior, which could be slapping self, biting self, or hitting head against a wall, the most important thing to address first would be the hitting head against the wall, as it has the highest potential to harm the student. Next, we must look at the factors that affect the convenience of the data collection that will be taking place, which could be the number of people available and other tasks required of the teacher. So, for example, a teacher cannot practically nor ethically focus fully on one student if the class has 15 total students. So, there are 3 general categories of collecting data. One will be recording and analyzing written reports that include all behaviors displayed during the observation, for example, an ABC assessment. Second, we have permanent product recording, which is observing and reviewing tangible products resulting of a behavior. Third would be recording the behavior as it is displayed through observational recording systems. We will now look at each of these 3 general categories closer. So, a common written report would be an antecedent behavior consequence assessment, commonly known as an ABC assessment. These can provide critical information for teachers but may be impractical because you have to really very closely observe the student. So basically the antecedents directly prior to the behavior is recorded, the behavior itself is recorded, and then the consequence that immediately followed the behavior is recorded. Here's an example of a common ABC assessment sheet. First, you would record the date or time, the setting it occurred in, and then you would do the antecedent, such as the professor asks the student to complete a task, the behavior, such as student throws something or runs out of the room, and the consequence, which could be either they get attention or they escape from the task. The second permanent product recording, also known as outcome recording, measures the effects of the behavior on the environment. For example, this could be the number of correct responses on a test or counting the number of bite marks on the arm of a student who displayed self-injurious behavior. There are two major advantages to permanent product recording. The first is that you can measure and record the behavior after the behavior has been displayed. This means the student does not need to be constantly monitored. The second one, permanent product recording can include the use of videotapes and audio tapes on a student's behavior. If proper permissions are in place, video and audio recording can be a powerful tool to allow the teacher to be fully focused in the moment on teaching and later have a way to collect data on the student that is 100% objective. Finally, we have the observational recording systems. With these systems, the behavior is recorded at the time it is occurring, and this can be used this can be done by the ways we discussed earlier, which is frequency, duration, latency, and the proportion that it's done in. One common observational recording system is event recording, which is a simple record of how many times the behavior occurs within an interval. And so this can be used with frequency data collection. It must be done with behaviors that are discrete, which means they have an obvious or agreed upon beginning or end. With event recording, if the time periods you observe the behavior are constant, you can simply use a frequency count. For example, he talked out 10 times a day or shared a toy 5 times during the 2-hour morning playtime. However, if the time periods you observe are not constant, you must convert the frequency count into a rate, which is similar to what we did earlier. For example, if on day 1 it was 4 hours, day 2 3 hours, and day 3 2 hours, you must convert the number of times they talked out into a rate to compare these between each other. An advantage of event recording is that data can be collected by simple slash marks on the data sheet as a record of one instance of the behavior, similar to a frequency tally. Disadvantages would be that if it is too high of a frequency, it could take too much effort to collect the frequency data. If the behavior occurs for a long time, such as tantrums, frequency is not a good data measure. Finally, if the behaviors do not have a discrete beginning and end, cannot take accurate frequency data on how many times it occurred, so event recording would not be a useful measure. Event recording can also be used when using a task analysis, or a list of individual steps when chained together form a complex behavior. So you basically record whether or not each of the steps was completed. A good example for this would be think of the steps to tie a shoe. You put the shoe on, you tighten the laces, you take the strings in both hands, you make the loops, you tighten. And you could record yes or no or a plus or minus on each of the steps if they occurred or not. A third kind of event recording is controlled presentations, which is where the teacher controls the number of opportunities or trials provided to respond. Each trial must have an antecedent, a response, and a consequence, and it is recorded as correct or incorrect. For example, if a teacher wants the student to complete a worksheet, you could have 5 opportunities where the teacher prompts the student to complete the worksheet, which is the antecedent. The response would be the student completing the worksheet, and then the consequence could be the teacher saying good job or giving them a candy of some sort. 2 additional observation recording systems is interval recording and time sampling. This allows you to record an approximation of the frequency in which the behavior is displayed. Instead of a frequency count, you count the number of intervals during which the behavior occurs. An advantage of this would be that it can be used for behaviors that are more continuous or longer in duration in nature and behaviors that are of high frequency. So within interval recording, you can have whole and partial. So whole interval recording is recording a plus if the behavior occurred during the entire interval. Partial interval recording is recording the behavior occurred if it occurred for any part of the interval. So it could occur for just like 1 second in the very beginning and you would still say that it occurred. With time sampling or momentary time sampling, you record that the behavior occurred if it happened at the very end of the interval. So let's say you have 2-minute intervals. If right when it hits 120 seconds, you look up, and if the behavior is occurring, you mark it, and if it isn't, you mark that it was not. So the behavior could be occurring for the entire interval, but if it stops right at the end, you would still write that it was not occurring. So of the 3 observational recording systems we have covered, event recording can provide the most accurate representation of the target behavior. Interval recording is the second most accurate. Time sampling is the least accurate, but also takes the least amount of effort for the teacher to conduct. As I hope this video has shown, data collection is an essential tool for educators to successfully evaluate if an intervention of a problem behavior is effective. I hope this video has made the varying factors and procedures involved with data collection clear.